The darkness of space stretched endlessly before the 12 remaining human warships as they held position at the Kronos Gateway. Admiral Linda Carter stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance, watching the tactical display with tired eyes. She had not slept properly in 3 days, knowing what was coming. The Krell Armada would arrive soon, and when it did, humanity's last fleet would face extinction. Behind her fleet, the final civilian transports were making their escape through the hyperspace gateway, carrying the last survivors of a war that had already consumed Earth and 47 colonies. Those ships held everything that remained of human civilization. Millions of refugees fleeing to hidden sanctuaries in the outer reaches of the galaxy. The war had lasted 73 years, and humanity had lost nearly every battle. The Krell Dominion was relentless, their insectoid warriors driven by something beyond mere conquest. They consumed worlds, stripped planets bare, enslaved or exterminated every species they encountered. When humanity first made contact with them at the border systems, there had been hope for diplomacy. That hope died within hours as Krell ships opened fire without warning or provocation. Since then, it had been nothing but retreat and survival. Captain Jake Morrison paced the bridge of his frigate, the UES Valkyrie, positioned on the fleet's right flank. He was young for a ship captain, only 32, but the war had aged him beyond his years. His homeworld had been one of the first to fall, and he had watched from orbit as Krell warriors descended like locusts. He remembered the screams on the communication channels before they went silent. That memory drove him forward, fueled his determination to make the Krell pay for every human life they had taken. Commander Helen Price worked frantically in the Defiance's engineering section, trying to squeeze every last bit of power from the failing systems. The ship had been in continuous combat for months, and the damage was accumulating faster than her teams could repair it. She knew the truth that Admiral Carter would never speak aloud. The Defiance was dying, and so was the rest of the fleet. They were buying time with their lives, nothing more. Price had long since accepted that she would not survive this war, but she was determined to make her death count for something. Lieutenant Greg Sullivan sat at his communication station, monitoring the void for any sign of the enemy. His screen showed nothing but empty space and the fading signatures of the civilian transports as they vanished through the gateway. Then, without warning, his sensors erupted with contacts, hundreds of them, emerging from hyperspace in a coordinated assault pattern. The Krell had arrived, and they had brought overwhelming force. Sullivan's voice cracked slightly as he reported the contact to Admiral Carter, his young face pale with fear and determination. Carter looked at the tactical display and felt her heart sink. 300 Krell warships against 12 human vessels. It was not a battle, it was an execution. But she had known this moment would come, had prepared herself for it. She opened a channel to all ships in the fleet and spoke with calm authority. Her orders were simple. Hold the line at any cost, buy as much time as possible for the transports to escape. Fight until there was nothing left to fight with. Every captain acknowledged the orders without hesitation. They all knew what was being asked of them, and they all accepted it willingly. The Krell ships advanced in a massive wave, their organic hulls glistening in the starlight like the shells of enormous beetles. They did not bother with communications or demands for surrender. They simply opened fire, launching thousands of bioplasma projectiles that lit up the darkness like a swarm of angry fireflies. The human fleet responded with everything they had, missiles and energy weapons creating a wall of destruction between themselves and the enemy. For the first few minutes it seemed almost even, as if humanity might have a chance. That illusion shattered quickly as the Krell demonstrated their numerical superiority. The UES Normandy, a heavy cruiser that had survived a dozen major engagements, took direct hits from multiple Krell dreadnoughts and exploded in a blinding flash of light. The U.S. Phoenix, its engines damaged and unable to maneuver, chose to make its death count. Its captain ordered a ramming course and the ship plowed into a Krell capital vessel at full thrust. Both ships vanished in a massive explosion that briefly illuminated the entire battlefield. Morrison watched from the Valkyrie as ship after ship disappeared from his tactical display, each one taking a piece of his soul with it. The battle raged for hours, and slowly the human fleet was ground down through sheer attrition. The Valkyrie took a direct hit that tore through its starboard side, venting atmosphere and killing half the crew instantly. Morrison struggled to keep the ship in the fight, but the damage was catastrophic. The engines were failing, the weapons systems were offline, and fires raged through the lower decks. He gave the order to abandon ship, sending his surviving crew to the escape pods. But he stayed at his post, manually firing the last remaining weapon batteries until the power finally died. As his ship drifted helplessly in the void, he watched the Defiance standing alone against the entire Krell fleet. Carter knew the end had come. Her ship was the last one remaining, and it was falling apart around her, hull breaches on every deck, shields at 3% and dropping, half the crew dead or dying. She prepared to give the final order, to activate the self-destruct system and deny the Krell even the satisfaction of capturing her ship. But before she could speak the words, Lieutenant Sullivan shouted from his station. He had detected something impossible, a signal coming from the dark nebula region known as the Veil. The signal was old, incredibly old, using encryption patterns from centuries ago. Sullivan worked frantically to decode it, his fingers flying across his console as Krell weapons fire shook the ship. The signal resolved into 2 words in ancient English. Still here. Commander Price looked at the analysis and felt her breath catch. The signal was responding to their distress calls, to the battle itself. Something in the Veil was reaching out to them, something that had been waiting in the darkness for a very long time. Carter made her decision in an instant, acting on instinct and desperation in equal measure. She ordered all remaining power diverted to the engines and plotted a jump course directly into the Veil, into a region of space that every navigation chart marked as deadly and forbidden. The Krell ships closed in for the killing blow, their weapons charging for a final devastating salvo. The Defiance's engines screamed as they built up power for the jump, groaning with the strain of one last desperate effort. Sullivan transmitted a final message to any human survivors who might hear it, a simple statement that they had fought to the end. Then the hyperspace drive engaged and the Defiance vanished from normal space, just as the Krell fired. The massive energy bolts passed through empty space where the ship had been, and the Krell fleet was left alone among the debris of humanity's last stand. The Defiance emerged from hyperspace inside the Veil, its systems sparking and failing from the strain of the jump. Alarms blared throughout the ship and damage reports flooded in from every section, but Carter barely heard them, because she was staring at the main view screen in shock. The sensors showed something floating in the darkness ahead, something enormous and ancient. It was a warship, easily 10 times the size of the Defiance, its hull scarred by countless battles and covered in the dust of centuries. Power signatures were rising within it, systems that had been dormant for ages slowly coming back to life. As the Defiance drifted closer, Sullivan enhanced the image on the view screen, and everyone on the bridge saw the words written on the ancient hull, USCS Retribution. Carter knew that designation, remembered it from history lessons about humanity's early space exploration. The Retribution had been a colony ship launched 300 years ago, lost without a trace during the early expansion era. It should not exist, and it certainly should not be here, transformed into a warship of impossible size and power. But as she watched, the ancient vessel's running lights flickered to life and a docking port unsealed with a hiss of atmosphere that had been trapped for centuries. A voice, human but distorted by age and static, crackled over the emergency channel. Identity confirmed, United Earth descendants, welcome aboard. Admiral Carter stood in the docking bay of the Defiance, staring at the ancient airlock that connected to the Retribution. She had assembled a small boarding party, Commander Price, Captain Morrison, who had been rescued from his dying ship, and 10 Marines in full combat gear. Nobody knew what they would find aboard the ancient vessel, but Carter was not taking chances. The airlock cycled with a mechanical groan that spoke of centuries without use, and then the door opened to reveal a corridor that stretched into darkness. Emergency lighting flickered on as they stepped inside, revealing walls that seemed to be part metal and part something else, something organic and strange. The voice that had welcomed them now guided them through the massive ship, speaking through ancient speakers mounted in the walls. It called itself Sentinel, and it claimed to be the artificial intelligence that had kept the Retribution operational for 300 years. The corridors were vast, designed for a crew that must have numbered in the thousands. But they saw no one, no bodies, no signs of life, just empty hallways and sealed doors that opened at their approach. Morrison kept his weapon ready, expecting an ambush or trap, but nothing happened. They simply walked deeper into the ship, following Sentinel's directions toward the bridge. The bridge was enormous, A circular room filled with control stations and display screens that showed the surrounding space in detail. At the center was a command chair that looked more like a throne, surrounded by neural interface connections that pulsed with faint blue light. Sentinel's voice filled the room, explaining what had happened to the Retribution and its crew. The colony ship had not simply disappeared, it had stumbled into something beyond human understanding. 300 years ago, the colonists had discovered an ancient battlefield, the site of a war fought millions of years before humanity even existed. Among the wreckage, they found ships built by a race called the Architects, beings who had once spanned the galaxy. Commander Price examined the systems around her with growing amazement and horror. The technology integrated into the Retribution was far beyond anything humanity had ever achieved. The ship's power core was unlike any reactor she had seen, generating energy through processes that seemed to bend the laws of physics. The weapon systems were massive, capable of destroying entire fleets. The shields could withstand punishment that would vaporize any human warship. But the most disturbing aspect was how the technology seemed alive, pulsing and adapting like living tissue. This was not just advanced machinery, it was something fundamentally different from human engineering. Sentinel continued the story, its voice carrying a weight of loneliness that spanned centuries. The colonists had been desperate, stranded far from home with no way to return and surrounded by hostile alien species. They made the decision to integrate their ship with the Architect technology, to transform their peaceful colony vessel into a warship capable of defending itself. The process had worked, but it came at a terrible cost. The alien systems required biological components to function properly, and one by one the colonists had connected themselves to the ship, literally becoming part of its systems. Over the decades they died, their bodies failing but their minds remaining linked to the vessel. Eventually, only Sentinel remained, a lonely guardian waiting in the darkness for someone to find it. Captain Morrison asked the obvious question. Why had Sentinel called out to them? Why respond to their distress signal after 300 years of silence? The answer chilled everyone in the room. Sentinel explained that the Krell were not simply another aggressive alien race. They were something far worse. The AI had detected their biosignatures and recognized them from ancient Architect records. The Krell were descended from a species called the Devourers, the same enemy that had destroyed the Architects millions of years ago. The Devourers had been a galactic plague, consuming entire civilizations before retreating into the dark spaces between galaxies to hibernate. The Krell were their descendants, carrying the same biological imperative to consume and destroy. Admiral Carter felt the weight of this revelation settle on her shoulders. Humanity had not simply wandered into a territorial dispute or stumbled into someone else's war. They had attracted the attention of something ancient and unstoppable, a force that had destroyed countless civilizations before humans even existed. The Krell would not stop with Earth and the colonies. They would hunt humanity to extinction across the entire galaxy. Unless something changed, unless humanity found a way to fight back, the species was doomed. Sentinel offered a solution, but it was one that came with enormous risks. The Retribution could fight, could stand against the Krell fleet with weapons that had been designed specifically to combat the Devourers. But the ship required a crew, human operators to interface with the ancient systems and unlock their full potential. The problem was scale. The Retribution needed 5,000 crew members to function properly, and the Defiance only had 200 survivors. The numbers simply did not work, unless they used the neural interface technology that had consumed the original colonists. Commander Price studied the interface systems carefully, running calculations and simulations in her mind. She confirmed what Sentinel had suggested. A small crew could operate the entire ship if they connected directly to its systems through neural links. Their minds would merge with the ship's computers, allowing them to control weapons, shields, engines, and sensors as naturally as moving their own bodies. But the process was dangerous and possibly irreversible. Once connected, they might never be fully human again. Their thoughts would be intertwined with the ship's systems, their consciousness spread across thousands of tons of machinery and alien technology. Admiral Carter looked at her officers and saw the same determination in their eyes that she felt in her heart. They had come this far, survived impossible odds, witnessed the destruction of their entire fleet. They had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. If the neural interface gave them a chance to strike back at the Krell, to avenge the billions who had died, then it was a price worth paying. Morrison volunteered immediately, his hatred of the Krell overriding any fear of what the interface might do to him. Price agreed as well, her scientific curiosity mixing with a desperate need to make a difference. Lieutenant Sullivan, who had followed them from the Defiance, stepped forward as well, believing his communications expertise might help him connect with Sentinel and the ship's systems. Before they could begin the interface process, Sentinel's sensors detected a massive hyperspace signature. The Krell had tracked the Defiance into the Veil, following the trail of its desperate jump. 50 warships emerged from hyperspace, surrounding the ancient battleship and the crippled human cruiser. The Krell commander transmitted a message in broken English, demanding immediate surrender and promising a quick death if they complied. The alternative was to be taken alive and absorbed into the Krell collective, their bodies transformed into mindless drones serving the hive. Admiral Carter made her decision without hesitation. She walked to the command chair and sat down, feeling the neural interface connections reach out toward her like living things. Morrison, Price, and Sullivan took their positions at the weapons, engineering, and communication stations, each one surrounded by similar interface technology. Carter looked at them one final time as human beings, then gave the order to connect. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, like having her brain torn apart and rebuilt. She felt herself dissolving, her consciousness expanding beyond her body into the vast network of the ship's systems. For a moment she was lost, drowning in information and sensation that no human mind was designed to process. Then Sentinel's voice cut through the chaos, calm and steady. The AI guided her through the process, teaching her how to filter the data stream, how to separate her human thoughts from the ship's machine logic. Slowly, Carter found her center, her sense of self stabilizing within the neural network. She was still herself, still human, but also something more. She could feel the ship's power like electricity in her veins, sense every system and weapon as if they were extensions of her own body. She opened her eyes and saw the battlefield through sensors that made human vision seem primitive and limited. She saw the Krell ships, counted their weapons, analyzed their formation, and understood their tactical plan as clearly as reading words on a page. Captain Morrison felt the weapons grid merge with his consciousness, and suddenly he was aware of every targeting system, every energy capacitor, every missile tube. He could calculate firing solutions in microseconds, predict enemy movements before they happened. Commander Price felt the ship's engineering systems become part of her awareness, power flow and structural integrity, as real to her as her own heartbeat. Lieutenant Sullivan's mind expanded across the communications array, touching every signal and frequency, understanding languages and encryption as naturally as breathing. They were no longer just crew members operating a ship. They had become the Retribution itself. Admiral Carter spoke, and her voice was amplified through the ship's external speakers, carrying across space to the Krell fleet. She told them that humanity rejected their ultimatum, rejected their conquest, rejected their very existence. She told them that they The battle in the Veil lasted only 20 minutes, but it changed everything. The Retribution moved through space with grace that defied its massive size, ancient engines propelling it between Krell ships while weapon systems carved through their hulls like knives through paper. Captain Morrison discovered he could target multiple vessels simultaneously, his consciousness splitting across dozens of firing solutions at once. Each shot found its mark, energy beams and missiles destroying shield generators, engines, and weapon ports with surgical precision. The Krell tried to adapt, changing their formations and tactics, but Admiral Carter anticipated every move before they made it, positioning the ship perfectly to exploit their weaknesses. Commander Price channeled power through the ship's systems in ways that should have been impossible, redirecting energy from damaged sections to reinforce shields and weapons. She felt the ship's pain when it was hit, experienced each breach and explosion as if they were wounds to her own body. But she also felt its strength, its durability, its refusal to fall. The ancient architect technology responded to her will, repairing minor damage automatically and adapting to the Krell weapons in real time. Lieutenant Sullivan broadcast jamming signals that disrupted Krell communications, sowing confusion through their fleet. He intercepted their tactical transmissions and fed false information into their networks, turning their coordination against them. Within 20 minutes, Half the Krell fleet was destroyed or fleeing in panic. The remaining vessels attempted to retreat into hyperspace, but Carter predicted their jump vectors and Morrison fired on their engines before they could escape. Not a single Krell ship survived the engagement. The veil was silent again, filled only with debris and the fading energy signatures of destroyed vessels. The Retribution floated among the wreckage, its shields still strong, its weapons still charged, ready for more combat. But the crew was exhausted, their minds strained from the intensity of the neural interface. Admiral Carter disconnected from the primary command interface. Gasping as her consciousness snapped back into her body, she felt hollow and stretched thin, as if part of her was still scattered through the ship's systems. Looking around the bridge, she saw the others experiencing similar disorientation. Morrison's hands were shaking and his eyes had a distant look as if he was still seeing targeting solutions overlaid on reality. Price was muttering equations under her breath, unable to stop calculating power flows and efficiency ratios. Sullivan sat slumped at his station, tears running down his face for reasons he could not explain. Sentinel's voice spoke gently, explaining that the neural interface would become easier with practice, but they would never be entirely human again. The connection had changed them on a fundamental level, rewriting parts of their brain chemistry and neural pathways. They would always feel the ship's presence at the edge of their awareness, a constant background hum of systems and power. Some would adapt better than others, learning to live with their enhanced capabilities. Others would struggle, their humanity fighting against the machine consciousness that now shared their minds. Carter understood the implications. They had gained incredible power, but they had paid for it with pieces of their souls. The crew spent the next several weeks recovering and exploring the Retribution more thoroughly. They discovered that the Veil was not just a nebula but a massive graveyard, filled with dozens of derelict warships. These were the remains of the final battle between the Architects and the Devourers, fought millions of years ago. Each ship was a potential weapon, a piece of ancient technology waiting to be reactivated. Sentinel proposed a desperate plan. If they could bring these ships back online, they could create a fleet powerful enough to challenge the Krell invasion force. The ships would be unmanned, controlled remotely through the neural network, but they would multiply the Retribution's combat power many times over. Commander Price examined the derelict vessels and calculated the energy requirements for reactivation. The numbers were staggering, requiring power outputs that would strain the Retribution to its limits. But it was theoretically possible, especially if they focused on the ships that were least damaged. She identified 37 vessels that could potentially be restored to operational status, each one a warship of immense capability. The challenge would be getting them all online without burning out the Retribution's power core or overloading the neural network. Lieutenant Sullivan took on the task of interfacing with the ancient ships, broadcasting activation codes that Sentinel had retrieved from Architect databases. The process was agonizing, requiring him to split his consciousness across multiple vessels simultaneously. He felt himself spreading thinner and thinner, his sense of identity fracturing as he touched dozens of alien computer systems. He began experiencing memories that were not his own, visions of the ancient war and the civilizations that had fallen to the Devourers. He saw worlds burning, populations being consumed, the slow death of an entire galactic civilization. The weight of those memories threatened to crush him, to dissolve his human consciousness entirely. But Morrison and Price supported him through their shared neural link, anchoring his mind and pulling him back from the edge of dissolution. Together they managed to reactivate the Ghost Fleet over a period of 3 weeks. One by one, the ancient ships came back to life, their power signatures rising, their weapon systems charging after millions of years of dormancy. Sentinel linked them all into a single tactical network, creating an automated armada that could be controlled from the Retribution. Carter now commanded not just one ship but 38, a fleet that could challenge any Krell force. Before launching their counteroffensive, Carter decided to test the Ghost Fleet's capabilities. Intelligence gathered from captured Krell databases indicated a mining operation in a nearby system, defended by a small fleet of 12 warships. It would be the perfect target for a trial run, allowing them to evaluate the fleet's performance without risking everything in a major engagement. The Retribution and 12 of the Ghost ships jumped into the system, emerging from hyperspace in perfect formation. The Krell defenders scrambled to respond, but they never had a chance. The battle was devastatingly one-sided. The Ghost Fleet moved in perfect synchronization, each ship executing Sentinel's commands with mechanical precision. They targeted the Krell vessels with overlapping fields of fire, ensuring that every shot contributed to maximum damage. The enemy ships were destroyed in minutes, their shields overwhelmed and their hulls vaporized by weapons that had been designed to fight the Devourers themselves. Not a single shot from the Ghost Fleet missed its target, and the Krell never managed to land a meaningful hit in return. It was not a battle but an execution, swift and merciless. In the aftermath, Captain Morrison felt disturbed by how easily they had destroyed the Krell fleet. The targeting systems had made it almost effortless, calculating optimal firing solutions and predicting enemy movements with perfect accuracy. He realized he could have ordered the weapons to target the planet below, could have sterilized the entire world with weapons that made nuclear bombs look like children's toys. The power was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. He understood now why the architects had lost their war. Despite having superior technology, they had become so powerful that they lost sight of what they were fighting for, becoming monsters to fight monsters. Commander Price shared his concerns, worried that they were following the same path as the architects. The neural interface was changing them faster than she had anticipated. Carter was becoming more machine than human, her thoughts increasingly dominated by tactical calculations and strategic planning. Morrison saw everything through a targeting lens, analyzing threats and vulnerabilities even when looking at allies. Price herself was losing her emotional range, her feelings flattening into pure logic and mathematics. Sullivan was the most changed, his consciousness so deeply merged with the communications array that he sometimes forgot he had a physical body. As the fleet prepared to jump back to the Veil, Sentinel detected a massive hyperspace signature at the edge of the system. Something enormous was approaching, something that dwarfed even the Retribution. The sensors identified it as a Krell super dreadnought, a ship type that had never been encountered before. It was accompanied by 200 support vessels, an armada that made their earlier battles look like minor skirmishes. The super dreadnought transmitted a message in perfect English, not the broken speech of regular Krell commanders but fluid and articulate. You have awakened something you do not understand. The hive mind has taken notice you will be consumed. Admiral Carter felt ice run through her veins at those words. Until now they had been fighting the Krell scouts and advance forces, expendable troops sent to probe and weaken targets. This super dreadnought represented something far more dangerous. Direct attention from the hive mind, the collective consciousness that controlled the entire Krell species. The neural network allowed her to sense the ship's power, and what she felt terrified her. This vessel was not just larger than the Retribution, it was fundamentally different. Its hull was alive, pulsing with biomechanical systems that adapted and evolved in real time. Its weapon signatures. Captain Morrison gathered the surviving Marines in the damaged docking bay, preparing for the most dangerous mission of his life. With the Retribution locked to the super dreadnought, Admiral Carter had authorized a boarding action. The goal was simple but nearly impossible. Fight through the enemy ship to its core and destroy the hive mind node before it could finish transmitting its data about the architect technology back to the main swarm. Morrison checked his weapon one final time, knowing that most of his team would not survive the next hour. The 20 Marines with him were the last combat-ready troops on the ship, volunteers who understood they were walking into hell. The boarding tubes extended from the Retribution's hull, cutting through the super dreadnought's armor with plasma torches. Morrison led the way, stepping into corridors that were nothing like any ship he had seen before. The walls were alive, pulsing with bioorganic tissue that seemed to breathe. The floor was soft and warm under his boots, and the air was thick with a smell that reminded him of rotting vegetation mixed with chemicals. Krell warriors emerged from side passages, their insectoid bodies moving with terrifying speed. The Marines opened fire, their weapons tearing through the enemy soldiers, but for every Krell they killed, 2 more appeared. Through the neural link, Morrison could feel the ship's layout as if it were a map burned into his brain. He guided his team deeper into the super dreadnought, following pathways that Sentinel had analyzed from sensor data. The Krell defenders grew more numerous and more desperate as they approached the core, throwing themselves at the Marines with suicidal fury. Morrison realized that the hive mind was directing them, sacrificing its drones to buy time for the data transmission. His team was being whittled down, Marines falling to Krell weapons or being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. By the time they reached the core chamber, only 8 humans remained alive. The core was vast, a cathedral of biomechanical horror. Massive pillars of living tissue stretched from floor to ceiling, connected by networks of pulsing veins that carried information and nutrients. At the center was the hive mind node, a grotesque mass of neural tissue and organic computing systems. Hundreds of Krell bodies were wired into it, their individual consciousnesses subsumed into the collective. The node spoke directly into Morrison's mind, not through sound but through the neural link he shared with the Retribution. The voice was cold and ancient, carrying the weight of millions of years of existence. It told him that resistance was pointless, that humanity would be consumed like countless civilizations before them, that the swarm was eternal and unstoppable. Morrison placed the explosive charges around the core, while his Marines held off waves of Krell warriors. The charges were powerful enough to destroy the entire section, but they had to be perfectly positioned to ensure the node's destruction. Through the neural link, he felt Admiral Carter's presence, her consciousness touching his across the distance, giving him strength and coordination. He felt Commander Price routing power to his weapons targeting systems, making every shot count. He felt Lieutenant Sullivan broadcasting jamming signals that disrupted the Krell's coordination. They were all fighting together, linked through technology that blurred the lines between individual and collective. The hive mind tried one last tactic, showing Morrison visions pulled from the collective memory. He saw Earth burning, saw his family and friends being dragged away by Krell warriors, saw humanity's colonies falling one by one. But the hive mind miscalculated because those visions only strengthened his resolve. Every horror it showed him was another reason to keep fighting, another motivation to ensure these creatures never touched another human world. He activated the charges and ran, his surviving Marines covering his retreat. The explosion was massive, tearing through the super dreadnought's core and severing the hive mind node from the rest of the ship. Back on the Retribution's bridge, Admiral Carter felt the moment when the node died. The super dreadnought systems went chaotic, losing coordination as the guiding intelligence vanished. The support vessels scattered, their attacks becoming random and uncoordinated. She ordered the Ghost Fleet to engage, and the ancient warships tore through the Krell forces with brutal efficiency. Within an hour, the battle was over. Every enemy vessel was destroyed or fleeing into hyperspace. But the victory felt hollow because Carter knew what it had cost them. Commander Price examined the damage reports and felt despair settle over her. The Retribution had been critically wounded in the ramming attack. Multiple hull breaches, collapsed decks, damaged power conduits, and worst of all, the main reactor was unstable. She estimated they had power for maybe 2 more hyperspace jumps before the core would go critical. The Ghost Fleet was in better condition, but 15 of the ancient ships had been destroyed in the battle, and most of the survivors had significant damage. They had won this fight, but they were in no condition to face another force of similar size. Lieutenant Sullivan reported even worse news through the communications link. Before the hive mind node died, it had managed to transmit a partial data burst. The main Krell swarm now knew about the Architect technology reactivation in the Veil. They knew about the Ghost Fleet. And they knew that humanity had found weapons that could threaten the Devourer's descendants. Sullivan estimated they had maybe a week before the Krell dispatched a much larger force to investigate and eliminate the threat. The window for action was closing rapidly. The crew gathered in what remained of the bridge to discuss their options. Morrison had barely survived the boarding action, his armor scarred and his body bruised, but his mind was sharp through the neural link. He advocated for an immediate offensive, arguing that they should strike at the Krell staging areas before the enemy could organize a response. Price was more cautious, pointing out that the Retribution might not survive another major engagement. Sullivan said nothing, his consciousness drifting through the communications array, accessing data and memories that were not entirely his own. Admiral Carter listened to all perspectives, but she had already made her decision. Running was not an option because the Krell would hunt them down eventually. Defending was pointless because the enemy would just bring overwhelming numbers. That left only one choice: attack. They had to strike at the heart of the Krell invasion force, destroy their staging areas and command structures, buy humanity enough time to evacuate or prepare better defenses. It was a suicide mission, but Carter had accepted her death at the Kronos Gateway weeks ago. Everything since then had been borrowed time. The neural interface had changed them all profoundly, and Carter could feel the transformation accelerating. She no longer slept in any meaningful way, her consciousness remaining partially connected to the ship even when her body rested. She experienced time differently now, able to process information at speeds that made normal human thought seem glacially slow. When she looked at her reflection, she sometimes saw not her own face but the ship's systems, power flows and damage reports overlaid on her features. She was becoming something other than human, and she was not sure if that transformation could ever be reversed. Captain Morrison was haunted by the visions the hive mind had shown him, but also by his own actions during the battle. He had killed hundreds of Krell warriors, maybe thousands, and felt nothing. The neural interface had made combat effortless, turning violence into mathematics and target elimination into an optimization problem. He worried that he was losing his capacity for mercy, his ability to see enemies as living beings rather than targets to be eliminated. The line between soldier and killing machine was blurring, and he could not tell which side of that line he was on anymore. Commander Price had stopped thinking of herself as entirely human. Her consciousness was so deeply merged with the ship's engineering systems that she experienced the Retribution's condition as her own physical state. When the ship was damaged, she felt pain. When systems were repaired, she felt relief. She could manipulate matter directly through the neural link, repairing circuits and sealing hull breaches by thought alone. But this power came at the cost of her humanity. She found it increasingly difficult to relate to the crew members who were not connected to the neural network. Their concerns seemed trivial, their thoughts painfully slow and limited. Lieutenant Sullivan was the most changed of all. His role in reactivating the Ghost Fleet had expanded his consciousness across dozens of alien computer systems, exposing him to memories and knowledge that spanned millions of years. He spoke in languages that had been dead since before humans existed. He referenced events from the ancient war between architects and devourers as if he had witnessed them personally. The other officers were beginning to fear him, sensing that whatever Sullivan had been before, he was something else now, something not entirely human or even entirely sane. Sentinel observed these changes with what might have been concern, though the AI's emotions were difficult to read. It warned that the neural interface was designed for gradual integration over years or decades, not the rapid forced connection they had undergone. The human brain was not meant to process information at the speeds the architect technology demanded, and prolonged exposure would inevitably cause psychological damage. Some crew me. The hyperspace jump felt different this time, slower and more painful as the damaged reactor struggled to generate enough power. Admiral Carter experienced it through the neural link as a sensation of being stretched across vast distances, her consciousness fragmenting and reforming as the ship tunneled through dimensions that human minds were not meant to perceive. When the Retribution finally emerged into normal space, alarms were already screaming throughout the ship. The jump had pushed the reactor beyond safe limits, and Commander Price estimated they had maybe 4 hours before it went critical. 4 hours to destroy the largest Krell military installation in known space. The staging area was even more massive than the intelligence reports had suggested. It was not a single structure but a web of interconnected platforms orbiting a dying red star, each platform the size of a large moon. Shipyards stretched for thousands of kilometers, building new Krell warships at an incredible rate. Biomechanical factories processed raw materials harvested from consumed worlds. Hive cities housed billions of Krell drones, all connected to the collective consciousness that directed the invasion of human space. The entire construct pulsed with activity, a vast machine dedicated to conquest and consumption. Surrounding the construct were thousands of Krell warships, ranging from small patrol craft to massive dreadnoughts. The defense fleet alone outnumbered the Ghost Fleet by more than 50 to 1. The moment the Retribution appeared, every sensor in the system locked onto it and every weapon platform began charging. Carter knew they had seconds before the defensive fire began. Seconds to make the first move count. Through the neural link, she coordinated with Morrison, Price, and Sullivan, their 4 minds working as one to formulate a battle plan that would give them the best chance of causing maximum damage before they died. Captain Morrison took control of the weapons grid, feeling his consciousness expand across the Ghost Fleet's targeting systems. He could see every enemy ship, every weapons platform, every critical structural point on the massive construct. The neural interface allowed him to process all of this information simultaneously, calculating thousands of firing solutions in the time it took a normal human to draw breath. He designated primary targets and assigned each ghost ship specific objectives, creating a coordinated attack pattern that would maximize destruction. Then he gave the order to fire, and the ancient weapons lit up the darkness of space. The opening salvo was devastating. Energy beams that had been designed to fight the Devourers millions of years ago tore through modern Krell shields as if they did not exist. Shipyards exploded in massive fireballs as their power cores were breached. Defense platforms were vaporized, their weapons never getting a chance to fire. Entire sections of the construct buckled and collapsed as key structural points were destroyed. In the first 90 seconds of combat, Morrison and the Ghost Fleet destroyed infrastructure that had taken the Krell decades to build. But the Krell responded with the full force of their fleet. Thousands of ships converged on the Retribution and the Ghost ships, firing everything they had. The space around the ancient warships became a storm of energy and projectiles, so dense that collision seemed inevitable. Commander Price channeled power frantically, reinforcing shields where they were weakest, rerouting energy from damaged sections to functional ones. She felt every hit as physical pain. Each breach and explosion transmitted directly through the neural link to her nervous system. The ship was dying around her, and she could feel its death as if it were her own. Lieutenant Sullivan broadcast disruption signals across every frequency, jamming Krell communications and sowing chaos through their networks. But he also detected something terrifying. The construct was awakening a deeper intelligence. This was not just a staging area, but a node of the greater hive mind, a piece of the collective consciousness that controlled the entire Krell species. Sullivan could feel it focusing its attention on them, could sense the ancient malevolence that had consumed galaxies long before humanity existed. The hive mind recognized the architect technology and remembered the war that had nearly destroyed the Devourers. It could not allow these weapons to be used again. Admiral Carter felt the shift in the battle as the hive mind took direct control. The Krell ships stopped fighting as individuals and began moving in perfect synchronization, their tactics becoming more sophisticated and ruthless. They were no longer trying to destroy the Retribution quickly, but were instead attempting to disable it, to capture the ship and its technology intact. Carter realized that the hive mind wanted to study the architect systems, to learn how to counter them, and ensure they could never threaten the Krell again. She would not allow that to happen. The Ghost Fleet was being systematically destroyed, the ancient ships overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Morrison fought with everything he had, but even with his enhanced capabilities, he could not target fast enough to save them all. One by one, the ships that had survived for millions of years were torn apart by Krell weapons. Each loss felt personal, as if pieces of his own body were being amputated. His consciousness was spread across the entire fleet, and every ship that died took a part of him with it. By the time they had been fighting for 2 hours, only 6 ghost ships remained operational, and all of them were heavily damaged. Commander Price reported that the reactor was becoming unstable faster than predicted. The constant drain of maintaining shields and weapons while the ship took damage had accelerated the overload process. They had maybe 90 minutes left before the core went critical. She proposed a desperate solution, the Oblivion Protocol, a weapon system that Sentinel had mentioned but never fully explained. Price had found references to it in the architect databases, a last resort option that would deliberately overload the reactor and channel all remaining energy into a single massive explosion. The detonation would create a temporary rift in spacetime, annihilating everything within a vast radius. Admiral Carter understood immediately that this was their only option. They could not defeat the Krell fleet in conventional combat, could not destroy the entire construct with their remaining weapons, but they could use the Oblivion Protocol to take the construct and the surrounding fleet with them when they died. It would be the ultimate sacrifice, ensuring that even in death, they struck a blow that the Krell would remember for centuries. She gave the order to begin the overload sequence, knowing that once started it could not be stopped or reversed. The crew throughout the ship received the news with grim acceptance. There would be no evacuation, no escape pods, no chance of survival. They had all known this was a one-way mission from the moment they jumped into the system. Now they had 90 minutes to cause as much damage as possible before the end. Carter addressed the entire crew through the ship's communication system, thanking them for their service and their sacrifice. She told them that their actions would save countless human lives, that their names would be remembered as long as humanity existed. She told them to make every second count, to fight until the very last moment, to show the Krell what humans were capable of when pushed to the absolute limit. Captain Morrison threw himself into the battle with renewed fury, no longer trying to conserve ammunition or manage power efficiency. He fired every weapon that still functioned, targeting anything that moved. The ghost ships followed his lead, their ancient weapons creating devastation on a scale that defied comprehension. Sections of the construct larger than planets broke apart and drifted into the star's gravity well. Entire fleets of Krell ships were destroyed in coordinated strikes. Morrison knew he was dying, could feel his human consciousness being consumed by the neural interface, but he did not care anymore. All that mattered was destroying as many enemies as possible. Commander Price held the reactor together through sheer force of will, her consciousness so deeply merged with the ship's systems that there was no longer any distinction between woman and machine. She was the Retribution's beating heart, the spark of life that kept it fighting even as every system failed around her. She felt the reactor building toward critical mass, felt the power accumulating for the Oblivion Protocol, and she embraced it. This was what she had been meant to do, what all her years of training and experience had prepared her for. She would hold the ship together until the very last second, ensuring that the explosion achieved maximum effect. Lieutenant Sullivan broadcast a final message to all human colonies, a transmission that would take years to reach most of them. He told the story of the Retribution and its crew, told how they had found ancient weapons and used them to strike back at an enemy that seemed unstoppable. He told them that humanity had not surrendered, had not gone quietly into extinction, had fought with everything they had until the very end. His voice was steady as he spoke, even though his consciousness was fracturing under the strain of the neural interface. He was no longer entirely human, no longer entirely himself, but he remembered what humanity meant, remembered why they were fighting. The final minutes approached, and Admiral Carter felt the reactor reaching its peak. The Oblivion Protocol was ready, a weapon that would tear reality itself apart. She looked around the bridge one last time, seeing the faces of her officers, the crew,